Welcome to my Classics Corner, where today we're going to discuss H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau. I knew it happened on a tropical island and it involved some kind of animal experimentation, and I was thinking I'd get some of that jungle vibe and maybe some of that wild man versus nature, and I really like that atmosphere and that kind of theme. The Island of Dr. Moreau is out of copyright, so you can read it freely either through Google Books or through your local library, or you can listen to it on audiobook. I knew it would be easier for me to listen than it would be for me to read. Just a warning for you guys, there are going to be some spoilers. I will try to note where they are, but I do feel like most people know some basic elements of premise for the Island of Dr. Moreau, and I don't think this particular story hinges on you not knowing where it's going. So first impressions for the Island of Dr. Moreau, there's a whole beginning part of the book that I had no idea was there, where our main character is shipwrecked and is trying to survive against the sea. I really liked this part of the story. I felt like it added a lot to our character. At one point in time, he and his fellow crewmen are trying to decide if they're going to survive through cannibalism. Our narrator says that he wasn't going to do it. Since no one but him survived the shipwreck, we sort of have to take his word for it. Our narrator goes out of his way on many occasions to portray himself as very saintly and moral, and I personally found that suspicious. Once our narrator is safely aboard a new ship, is introduced to a black manservant of the doctor's, and immediately he feels like there is something wrong. Also, the rest of the crew was really bullying him and beating him and being apparently cruel. This element was really awkward because I knew this black manservant that was disfigured or had something wrong with him was actually one of the animal people that Dr. Moreau had created. And comparing a black person to an animal person immediately set off all these weird feelings and alarm bells for me. And H.G. Wells does go to great lengths to sort of comment negatively on English colonization and on the mindset that people of different colors and cultures are lesser than the English man. He has a pretty scathing social commentary. It's hard to get through this part. I think it's worth reading through this, but if you're sensitive to these kind of comparisons, then this book is not going to be for you. And I totally understand. And a secondary theme that comes up because he thinks that this animal person is a disfigured or disabled black person is some ableism and some disfigurement shaming, and that goes on throughout the entirety of the book. The people who do it are portrayed as immoral and wrong for doing it. These are overtones that persist all the time in our culture today. So again, this is an element that a modern reader might be sensitive to and might not enjoy while reading. Captain and his crew, the way they're treating this manservant, which channels some serious Frankenstein vibes for me. Just the fact that the whole crew and the captain immediately are afraid of what's different from them, and they don't look at this person's actions. They only look surface level and make judgments based off of that. Something I didn't know going into the Island of Dr. Moreau is that a lot of people qualify it as a Gothic novel, and in this correlation between Frankenstein and some other Gothic novels, I can see why you might classify and why you might place this novel in a Gothic circle, which we'll talk about a little bit more just below. It's kind of interesting how this whole ocean thing takes place because the well-meaning doctor keeps pushing the manservant into situations where he has to confront the captain and the crew, which actually keeps putting him in danger and keeps escalating the situation, even though I think the doctor's intention is to get people used to the manservant, show that he's harmless. And I can sort of see a parallel in how we look at allies today. They keep saying oh, go ahead and ignore discrimination or ignore that. It's just words. And they keep pushing people into situations that could be dangerous for them. And this book also shows how potentially dangerous it is for someone to intervene on someone else's behalf as well, because our narrator does eventually intervene on behalf of the manservant, keep him from getting beaten to death or thrown off the boat. And because of this, the captain remembers that, and when he has an opportunity, he kicks him off too. I think this is an interesting conversation to bring up how to be a good ally, what bad allyship looks like, and also some of the risks of being an ally to someone who's being discriminated against. These are all helpful topics I think to talk about, and I enjoyed how this story neatly in the first third, maybe even only in a couple of pages, like encapsulated all those elements. Another thing I noticed in this story, there are zero women. It's an old story, so I accept that. And it's better, I guess, to have no women than to have women portrayed in stereotypical or annoying ways. I just think a little bit it was a missed opportunity because there were a couple of ways you could have easily inserted a female character and had them bring value. Like if Dr. Moreau had a wife and she'd come with him on his exile, we could have got her opinion on what was going on. Or we could have seen how she was reacting, like if she outraged that her husband was exiled, was she mad at him because now she's away from society? Does she think his work is important and genius, or does she think it's mad and deranged? We could have got another flavor from another circle. Because something that I don't think is hit on very well in this story is what do people think about these experiments? It seems like Dr. Moreau was doing it just because he can. And in that regard, it's just horrible and gross. But if there was like a larger goal, like
this will help humanity in these ways, or having this kind of power over nature could eventually lead us to doing these other things,
then we have like an actual conversation going on and not just someone mad with their own power. And I know the fact that Dr. Moreau was exiled sort of indicates the society as a whole is disgusted by what he's doing. But if we had someone close to the doctor who knew his positives, who knew his inner mind, like a wife might, or a daughter, then we could see a little glimpse into Dr. Moreau, past his own arrogance and maybe more into his internal thoughts. Or we can see someone who's sort of straddling two worlds, like the world of society and sympathizes with Dr. Moreau. Our narrator seems pretty like shoulder shruggy about it. He's like,
the public is just like squeamish, and I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with what Dr. Moreau is doing.
Or at least that's his first take when he recalls the doctor and his situation. He doesn't know exactly what the experiments are at this juncture. He just knows that whatever they were got him exiled. When we're first introduced to the island, Dr. Moreau comes out, he shakes our narrator's hand, and then he goes back to his important work. And the other doctor and our narrator kind of chill and having tea. And there's just all this screaming from the animals that can be heard in the next room. I was immediately afraid by how no one reacted. Vivisection is always an appreciated horror element. I know if we were telling this story today, we'd have to modernize this somehow because vivisection obviously doesn't lead to turning animals into people. It's such great imagery, and it was so smart to use that technique specifically as the way to transform animals into humans. And I can see like a lot of no sleep and creepy pastas in this category borrowing elements from this classic. Vivisection, turning humans into animals, or stitching animals and people together seem to feature pretty heavily into a lot of the stories in the creepy pasta mix that I end up reading. While none of them capture everything that's going on in the island of Dr. Moreau, they do a great job capturing elements of body horror, the premise of scientists trying to make something more than human, or scientists lost in their own arrogance trying to play God. And they really capitalize on those terrifying elements and those questions of what makes us human. Can the island of Dr. Moreau make it into our goth party? Originally, when I heard people calling this a gothic novel, I was really reluctant to give it any credence. This book doesn't have supernatural elements that I love in Gothic horror, and it doesn't have that focus on human mortality. There's a certain ennui attached to this story, and some creepy elements that are similar to those you'd find in Frankenstein, which is obviously Goth. But instead of bringing someone back to life, this is about turning animals into people and exploring what makes something human. So I just sort of dismissed it, but there are some elements of this that do line up with Gothic horror, so that puts me a little bit on the fence. Obviously, there's horror elements involved. Character is king here. We do a pretty deep dive into our narrator and a little bit of a dive into Dr. Moreau. And then, of course, there's also elements of loneliness and longing, both from the human animals and from Dr. Moreau, the doctor, and our narrator. All feel isolated in different ways. Dr. Moreau has been physically exiled. Our narrator is stranded on this island for at least 6 months. The doctor who is assisting Dr. Moreau does not want to be on the island and obviously misses English society. And the human animals are adrift in this experiment. They seem lost, they seem confused, they seem not able to connect with each other, and also not able to make any lasting connections with any of our fully human characters either. And it seems like what Dr. Moreau has done to them is perhaps the cruelest fate ever, because they're cast out both from their animal society and the animal rules that they knew, and are never going to be embraced by humanity or ever able to fully pick up the mantle of human. And as this is a science fiction story and not a paranormal story, I guess we have to swap the supernatural element for science element, and if that's the case, then the vivisection part of this story fits in pretty well for a supernatural element, the scientific element. It sparks an idea in our mind. You can see how it's both an enemy, right? Because vivisection is terrifying, but in this particular situation is used for good, or at least it's used in a way that transforms these animals into humans, and some of our characters are saying that's good for a scientific breakthrough. There's even an element of our narrator questioning the reality around them because of his experiences on this island, sees humans as these animal-human hybrid, and because of that, he has to live alone and isolated. He just sees that potential in all of his fellow man now. You could say that that's clarity and him seeing how things really are, or you could say that's an element of madness and reality bending that we would see in more Gothic novels. And I think, too, the island that he stays on has a real sense of palpable place and fear and longing and terror involved. So while at first blush I thought it was kind of silly that people were calling this a Gothic novel, after I really dove deep and considered the themes and some of the other elements, I could see how the Gothic mantle applies to the island of Dr. Moreau, and it's welcome at our goth party anytime. I think what makes this book a classic and what makes it worth reading despite all those problematic first impression elements I talked about at the top is some of the deeper themes that you can find in the island of Dr. Moreau. Like all of H.G. Wells' works, is really thoughtful and complex. In this case, the obvious first theme you talk about is the ethics of scientific experimentation, is how similar Dr. Moreau's methods and experiments are to some that you can see from Nazi doctors, particularly chilling because this book was written before World War II. The cruelty of the experiments, the curiosity, and the desire to sate that curiosity at the expense of our human empathy is all present. For modern readers, there's a certain level of speculation on how we treat animals in our world today and what their place is in society. We can see even in the Victorian era where this is set, people did exile Dr. Moreau for his vivisection experiments, but we can also see men of science kind of shoulder shrug a little bit at it and think that some of the things society cast them out for is small-minded. But like in our world today, where we have so many animal rights movements, so many concerns about treating even animals we're going to eat humanely, let alone animals that we think of as companion animals, it becomes an entirely different conversation. And I think this is a great book to start talking about animal rights and animal welfare. And it also leads to a larger philosophical point on what is the nature of human nature. Humans like to separate ourselves from animals, and as such, we think there's something special about our society, or our actions, or our mental capacity that puts us at a different level than animals. But if all you have to do is a little bit of vivisection, then suddenly these animals not only understand human speech, but can learn it, and they can follow the rules that are given, and they can do all these other things like walking on two legs. They're definitely close enough that you could qualify them as human. And if you can qualify them in this state as human, it means the animal they killed from had that capacity. So really, what is the difference? And there's also like an argument to be made that the difference is in our capacity for cruelty, that we subjected these animals to this horrible experimentation to make them more like us or make it so that we could talk to them. And that's not necessarily a good thing or something that we should be striving for going forward. There's also a lot of interesting elements contrasting the nature of animal savagery versus human cruelty. These human animals are made up of both predator and prey animals. And as the predator animals slowly revert to their natural self, they do tend to hunt and eat the prey animal. This is something Dr. Moreau was trying to teach out of them or civilize out of them or whatever, but it's in their nature as predators to eat the prey animals. We could think of it as a brutal murder, but at least when the predator murders a prey human animal, they eat them. It's for survival, it's a natural instinct. It's described brutally and like a murder would be. It has something that's essentially different, at least in my interpretation of it, from a human murder. And I think it's worth comparing and contrasting that both humans and animals do terrible things, but their reasons for doing it are often really different. There's also this sly critique on religion in this story that I just love, because Dr. Moreau is trying to teach these animals to be more human. He kind of creates a fake religion around the law, and he uses this to enforce the behavior he wants on his human-animal experiments in a similar way that we could see religion enforcing certain societal norms and keeping certain people down. So I enjoyed this story, but I want to workshop it just a little bit for a modern audience, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a shot. Obviously, with the straight vivisection experiment, that's not going to work anymore. We're going to have to do something a little bit different. Maybe the vivisection parts are more like a visual for creepiness, and we use that to splice human and animal DNA together, and we do the whole test tube creepy hybrids thing that eventually lead us to more human-animal looking adult creatures, but we can have all of the failed embryos and failed experiments there on the table too, just being creepy body horror elements. I'd add a female character. I might add 2 or 3 female characters, to be honest. One easy way, as I talked about before, is to give Dr. Moreau a wife. We could also make Dr. Moreau's assistant a woman, and in some ways that kind of plays into his role anyways. A female doctor in that time would be shunned, and she might not have any options except going with Dr. Moreau into his exile and helping him with this experiment. She might also feel like she has to prove herself, and she sees Dr. Moreau's ambitious work is one way for her to do that. Or she might think the same way society exiled her, put her down, told her she couldn't do this kind of work, is what happened to Dr. Moreau and his experimentation, and that's created a fervor in her to prove society wrong on both fronts. I just think that adds a little complication, a little extra wrinkle for us to consider. Another thing that I think would make sense for us to do is to make the black manservant in the front actually a black manservant, or potentially to have some kind of native caretakers on the island. I know we want to see the animal creature hybrids. There's all kinds of problems with adding the animal creature on the boat, starting with the fact that now we're comparing black people to the animal creature. That's not great. We're making the animal creature a disfigured human and sideways attacking disfigured or disabled humans that way. Also not great. If we just make him a straight black person, we've added an extra element in the story, and we've gotten rid of some of those troubling problems in the beginning. And it kind of makes sense for us to have some native African people living on the island coming with the doctor to get the animals from Africa. That makes sense. He can pick out which ones are healthy and which ones will make the journey. He can also identify what those animals will need while they're in their animal form. We do talk a little bit about the ecology of the island. They had to bring a bunch of rabbits back because all the rabbits had been eaten on the island. If we had this black man and maybe his wife or his family or whatever living on the island, then they could sort of be the caretakers and the curators. They could be there to make sure the natural balance of life is being observed, and they could be there adding extra security to the animal shelters and containment areas. And it would give us an opportunity to get the native perspective on what's happening on the island. Do they think that this is just natural human progression? Is this something that we just expect from the white man? Is this something that's going to end in tragedy? Do they think that it's greatness and some kind? I don't know exactly how we would categorize it, because I would need more research on the specific African culture, and I'd probably need to consult with some African people to get everything down correctly. But I just feel there's already this commentary about colonialization going on in the story, and a white man's false sense of superiority compared to all other cultures and races. And if we could bring another race onto the island, get their thoughts on it, and get them prepping for worst case scenario, or maybe thinking that this is going to be a huge success. It would just add another element and deepen some of the themes that we're already talking about in the story. That's going to be my thoughts on the island of Dr. Moreau. I think I rated it 4 or 5 star read. It's not a perfect read for a modern audience, but I do think it's near perfect when you consider what time it was created. I would love to see a modern adaptation of this story, and I think it could be done really easily. If you're looking for more science fiction style stories, I have a playlist of that here. Tell me in those comments down below if there's another classic work you'd like me to review. Bye!